CBSY and our Recap Fridays full episodes January 30th, 2026. There is something disturbingly fitting about the fact that when Mariah Copeland finally crossed a line that no one ever believed she would, she did it with the ghost of Ian Ward whispering in her ear and a baby in her arms. On paper, it almost defies logic. Why now? Why Dominic? Why this particular break from reality when so many of her earlier traumas had already threatened to shatter her? You could trace it back, if you wanted to build a case, to the years she spent being molded and manipulated by Ian, the man who raised her only to drug her, isolate her, and try to twist her into a bride instead of a daughter. You could trace it to the surrogacy and the baby who came before, the child who was once nicknamed Bowie, the one she carried and then handed over because that was the agreement, because love was supposed to mean stepping aside for what was best. You could fold Arya into that history as well. Another reminder that Mariah's relationship with motherhood has always been filtered through pain, compromise, and sacrifice. All of it piles together into a kind of emotional sediment, layer upon layer of unresolved grief and stolen agency, until one day something tiny shifts and the whole structure gives way. In that context, it almost doesn't matter that the specifics are messy or that even the audience can't quite keep every thread of Arya, Bowie, and Dominic straight. The important thing is that somewhere in Mariah's psyche, those threads tangled into a single knot. And when Ian's phantom voice started tugging on it, everything unraveled at once. The why becomes less about plot mechanics and more about the inevitable collapse of someone who has been holding too much for too long. In Mariah's fractured perception, Ian doesn't need a rational motive to push her toward escape. He only needs to replay the patterns he etched into her before she understood what they were. He becomes, in her mind, the embodiment of a terrible logic that love is something you prove by running, by cutting ties, by creating an us against the world narrative that isolates you from anyone who might talk you down. When he appears in her hallucinations and tells her that she and Dominic were meant for each other, that they have both been misunderstood and mishandled by the people who claim to love them, it doesn't have to make sense to anyone else. It only has to resonate with the part of Mariah that remembers how it felt to be chosen and claimed by someone, even if that someone was a monster. The tragedy is that she knows, deep down, that none of it is true. She knows Dominic is Abby and Devon's son, that he belongs in the life that was built for him, not in the fantasy bunker Ian is selling her. She knows that Bowie was from another chapter, another wound that never fully healed, and that trying to rewrite that history through Dominic is both impossible and wrong. But reality has never been the only force at work in Mariah's life. The ghost of Ian Ward represents a gravitational pull toward her most broken instincts. And when the pressure of her current life fights expectations, its constant reminders of the baby she carried but could not claim collides with that pull. It becomes terrifyingly easy for her to accept this poisonous reassurance. If she takes Dominic and disappears, she can rewrite everything. She can undo the feeling that she has always been the one left behind, the one who gives and is never allowed to keep. So she runs. What makes the situation so volatile is that Abby and Devon are operating with none of this context. They don't see Mariah's late-night conversations with a man who isn't there, the way the memory of Ian has seeped back into her thoughts like toxic smoke, or the way the name Bowie still echoes in the corners of a heart that was forced to move on, without closure. From their vantage point, the surrogacy and its emotional fallout were dealt with years ago. The obsession around Bowie belonged to a different era, one that was painful but finite, sealed off after everyone agreed to do what was right. They have no reason to think that those scars are still open, let alone that they could be driving Mariah towards something as extreme as abducting Dominic. To them, Mariah is a trusted figure, someone who knows their rhythms, their vulnerabilities, their son's needs. She is the person they entrusted with some of the most intimate moments of their family story. So when Dominic vanishes, their first instinct is not to glance in her direction at all. They look outward. They look for ransom notes, security breaches, enemies with vendettas, or financial motives. A kidnapping, in their minds, is a crime committed by strangers, not a desperate act birthed out of love gone sideways. The horror of what is happening only begins to penetrate when the familiar patterns of a conventional abduction fail to appear. There is no demand for money, no communication from a shadowy figure threatening harm in exchange for leverage. Instead, there is a void. Dominic is simply gone. Hours stretch into a day, then another, and the sickening realization dawns that this is not a negotiation, it is a disappearance. Abby, who has always struggled to balance her need for control with the vulnerability of motherhood, begins to unravel in small, terrifying ways. Every sound becomes a possible clue, every unanswered ring, every unreturned text a potential link to her missing son. Devin, who built his sense of identity as Dominic's father on a foundation of togetherness and intention, finds that foundation crumbling under the weight of helplessness. Together they move through their home like ghosts, touching tiny clothes, empty toys, bottles left on counters as if proximity to Dominic's things might pull him back into the room. The police circulate questions and possibilities, but nothing feels concrete. Not knowing is a special kind of torture, one that strips even the strongest people down to their most animal fear. Meanwhile, Mariah's world is narrowing with every passing hour. What began as a flight fueled by Ian's phantom encouragement and the intoxicating belief that she and Dominic could begin a new life quickly deteriorates into a claustrophobic trap. The reality of caring for a baby on the run of managing feedings, sleep, and safety while constantly looking over her shoulders far more brutal than the fantasy Ian painted in her mind. His imagined presence, once a twisted comfort, becomes more sinister as exhaustion sets in. The more she tries to hold onto the narrative that she is protecting Dominic from people who never truly saw him, the more her own body betrays her. Her hands shake when she tries to prepare a bottle. Her thoughts fall out of sequence. Dominic's cries become impossible to interpret, threading guilt into every wail. Is he hungry? Afraid? Missing the arms he recognizes, the voice he associates with home? Mariah cannot answer those questions without admitting that she has done the very thing she promised herself she would never do again. She has let Ian right over her sense of self, twist her love into something that looks like possession instead of care. Outside the immediate circle of Abby, Devin, and Mariah, the ripple effects of Dominic's disappearance move through Genoa City and land, as they so often do in the lap of the Newmans in their orbit. Sharon, with her long, complicated history of trauma and recovery, recognizes shades of herself in Mariah's spiraling behavior, even if she doesn't yet know the full extent of what has happened. The idea that her daughter might be reliving old wounds in a new, dangerous form both terrifies and enrages her. Nick, ever the protector, channels his fear into a search for someone to blame, because blame at least feels actionable. For a while, his anger has other targetsmen, Sienna, the convenient names that attach themselves to previous crises and misjudgments. They carry the weight of mistakes that led to fractures in the family, so it is easy to drape new outrage over old resentments. But grief and panic rarely sit still. Once Sharon and Nick have burned through their anger at Matt, once their fury at Sienna begins to cool in the face of more pressing questions, their focus slides, inevitably, towards someone else who has always stood at the crossroads of chaos in Genoa City, Phyllis. Phyllis becomes the lightning rod not necessarily because she is objectively the most culpable, but because she is a familiar conduit for frustration, a person whose history makes it easy to believe she could have nudged events in some destructive direction without fully considering the fallout. Sharon and Nick have a well-worn reflex when it comes to Phyllis. They know how to pour disappointment into the grooves of old betrayals. Maybe she encouraged someone when she should have intervened. Maybe she gave space to a scheme, or minimized a warning sign, or simply shut her eyes to the possibility that someone was unraveling, because it was convenient to do so. The specifics almost don't matter. What matters is that focusing on Phyllis gives Sharon and Nick something to hold onto in a situation that otherwise feels as amorphous as fog. They cannot immediately locate Mariah, cannot instantly return Dominic, cannot rewind the clock to the moment just before everything fell apart. But they can demand answers from Phyllis. They can question her judgment, her influence, her role in the chain of events that led them here. even if that role is more atmospheric than direct. It is easy to dismiss this as scapegoating, and in some ways it is. But it is also a portrait of how people who are drowning in fear behave. They reach for the nearest narrative that feels solid and familiar, even if it isn't entirely fair. Mariah's decision to run with Dominic was ultimately her own, driven by a convergence of past trauma, unresolved grief, and the manipulative echo of a man who once held her life in his hands. Abby and Devon's inability to see it coming is rooted in a natural human tendency to believe that wounds scab over just because time has passed. Sharon and Nick's anger at Phyllis is part defense mechanism, part genuine frustration with a woman whose name has so often been linked with upheaval. Ian Ward's ghost remains the invisible puppeteer, not in the literal sense, but as the symbol of every unchecked scar that was allowed to fester in the dark. When you put all of those pieces together, the storyline stops being about a single irrational act and becomes a mosaic of accumulated neglect, misjudgment, and emotional shortcuts. In the end, the most unsettling part of this whole mess is not that Mariah runs, or that she takes Dominic with her under the influence of a man who once nearly destroyed her. It's that no one sees it clearly until it's already too late. The past is allowed to sit in the background like a closed book. Bowie and Arya and Ian Ward relegated to ancient history, until suddenly those half-forgotten chapters come roaring back and devour the present. The horror hitting Abby and Devon is not just that their son is missing, but that he is missing in a way they never considered possible, at the hands of someone they trusted, for reasons that don't fully make sense even as they unfold. The fury consuming Sharon and Nick is not just about Dominic's disappearance, but about the realization that no one truly watched Mariah closely, enough to see how close she was to the edge. And the audience, watching it all, may roll their eyes at the scrambled continuity of Bowie or the murky logic of Ian's influence. But beneath the inconsistencies is a painfully recognizable truth. When trauma is treated as backstory instead of an ongoing fault line, it doesn't disappear. It waits, and when it finally cracks open, it rarely does so in a way that is neat, rational, or easy to untangle. What makes Phyllis Summers' role in Kane Ashby's campaign against Victor Newman so infuriating is not simply that she chose a side, but that she did so while rewriting reality in a way that conveniently absolves her of responsibility and reframes Victor as the villain when, in this particular instance, he is not. Phyllis dares to present herself as a strategist fighting tyranny, yet the foundation of her involvement is built on an act that is, by any objective measure, indefensible. The program at the center of this power struggle was not something Victor stole in the shadows, or seized through coercion. It was something he acquired legitimately, through channels that may have been ruthless, but were nonetheless lawful within the brutal ecosystem of Genoa City business. Victor Newman did what Victor Newman has always done. He outmaneuvered his opponents, within the rules of the game as it is actually played. Not the sanitized version people like Phyllis invoke when it suits them. The real transgression occurred later, quietly and deliberately, when Phyllis took something that did not belong to her and weaponized it. First by handing it to Victor, and then by enabling Kane to use that very same stolen material as a means of hunting Victor down. The circular hypocrisy is staggering. Phyllis helped place the weapon in Victor's hands and then recoiled in outrage when that weapon was used, choosing instead to align herself with Kane in an effort to punish the man she herself empowered. This is what exposes Phyllis as the true antagonist in this scenario. Not because she lacks justification in her hatred of Victor, but because she refuses to acknowledge the moral line she crossed long before Kane ever stepped into the picture. Phyllis did not stumble into the situation through naivety or manipulation. She engineered it. Her decision to steal the program was not born of desperation or survival, but of ego and control. The same impulses that have guided her most destructive choices for years. She convinced herself that because Victor is capable of cruelty, anything done to undermine him must be righteous by default. That logic collapses the moment scrutiny is applied. Victor did not steal from Phyllis, Phyllis stole. Period. Kane's plan to take Victor down rests on an ethical contradiction that Phyllis refuses to confront, because doing so would force her to admit that, For once, Victor is the innocent party, and that is a truth she cannot tolerate, because it dismantles the narrative in which she is always the wrong woman, striking back at an unjust system. This tendency to rationalize indefensible behavior under the banner of revenge or justice is precisely why Sharon and Nick's anger eventually circles back to Phyllis. Even amid far more urgent crises like Dominic's disappearance, Phyllis has made a career out of positioning herself at the center of chaos, and then expressing shock when that chaos explodes outward and harms people she claims not to want hurt. Her alliance with Kane is not about ideology or principle. It is about the thrill of power and the satisfaction of watching Victor bleed. Regardless of who gets caught in the crossfire, in choosing to stand beside Kane, she implicitly endorses his recklessness, his willingness to destabilize families and institutions alike in pursuit of dominance. That choice strips her of any moral high ground she might otherwise claim. At the same time, the situation with Dominic Winters underscores the difference between true villainy and catastrophic misjudgment driven by trauma. Dominic is not abandoned. He is not unwanted. Abby and Devon's entire existence has narrowed to a single, desperate objective: bringing their son home. They are willing to bend rules, expose vulnerabilities, and tear their own lives apart if that is what it takes to be reunited with him. Their love is not theoretical or conditional. It is immediate and consuming. Mariah knows this. On some level, she has always known this, which is precisely why her actions cut so deeply into her own psyche. She did not take Dominic because she believed Abby and Devon did not care. She took him because she believed she herself could not survive another loss without breaking completely. That distinction does not excuse what she has done, but it does explain why the emotional consequences are hitting her with such force. Mariah's greatest fear is not punishment or exposure. It is the moment when Dominic begins to register that something is wrong in a way that transcends infant confusion. When he senses distress, when his cries sharpen into something closer to fear, when the absence of Abby and Devon stops being abstract and becomes visceral. That realization threatens to shatter the fragile fantasy Mariah has been clinging to. If Dominic reacts with panic, if his body and instincts tell him that the game is over and that the people he knows as his parents may never come back, Mariah will be forced to confront the reality that her actions are not protective or loving, but actively harmful. That moment has the power to push her beyond her emotional breaking point, because it directly contradicts the story she has been telling herself to survive. If Dominic's distress alone is not enough to pierce Mariah's defenses, then Tessa Porter represents a different, equally potent catalyst. Tessa is not a symbol of authority or judgment. She is a symbol of unconditional connection. She knows Mariah in a way few others do, not as a caretaker or a patient or a problem to be solved, but as a partner who has seen her at her weakest and chosen her anyway. Tessa's involvement in any rescue effort would not be about force or confrontation. It would be about reminding Mariah of who she is when she is not operating under the influence of fear and hallucination. Where Ian Ward's ghost feeds on Mariah's sense of isolation and destiny, Tessa represents grounding, reality, and choice. She can speak to the part of Mariah that still wants to do the right thing, but no longer trusts herself to know what that is. No matter which emotional lever ultimately breaks through Dominic's fear, Tessa's voice, or Mariah's own exhaustion, the outcome feels inevitable. Mariah is not a monster, even if she has done something monstrous. She is a traumatized woman who allowed an old wound to dictate a catastrophic decision. Sooner rather than later, she will be forced to see that clinging to Dominic is not saving either of them. That continuing down this path will only compound the damage in ways she may never be able to undo. That realization will not be gentle. It will rive with shame, grief, and the crushing awareness that love does not give her the right to take what belongs to someone else. When that moment comes, the long-delayed reunion between Abby, Devon, and Dominic will finally take place, not as a triumphant victory, but as a fragile beginning. It will be the end of a nightmare, not the erasure of it. Abby and Devon will hold their son with a gratitude sharpened by terror, knowing how close they came to losing him. Dominic's return will not magically restore the sense of safety that was stolen, but it will give them something to rebuild around. And Mariah, standing on the other side of that reunion, will have to live with the knowledge that she caused this pain and with the equally important knowledge that she stopped before it became irreversible. In the broader landscape of Genoa City, the contrast between Phyllis and Mariah becomes stark. Mariah will ultimately recognize her wrongdoing and step aside, so that a family can be made whole again. Phyllis, by contrast, continues to justify her actions, to cloak selfish ambition in righteous language, and to cast herself as a hero in a story where her hands are anything but clean. One woman will confront her guilt and choose accountability. The other doubles down, convinced that her hatred of Victor entitles her to rewrite ethics entirely. And that difference, more than any corporate coup or vendetta, is what truly defines who the villain is.